All Honorable Men by James Stewart Martin. Narrated by Jack Chikijian. The dedication reads, "To my children, members of a generation entitled to ask, what did you do about it?" Preface. Any man has a right to stop after a chain of harrowing experiences and to ask why things happened as they did. Our generation has had its share of harrowing experiences, and therefore the peculiar chain of circumstances that kept me enmeshed for 5.5 years was not unusual. It is not simply the rebirth of German nationalism and Nazism that occasioned the writing of this book, nor even the return to power of the industrialists who put the Nazis in. These events in themselves are significant, but more so is the fact that, along with them, action was aborted on other questions in Germany. Questions of the treatment of organized labor, the improvement of agriculture, the reform of public education, the public ownership or control of industry, and others just as basic. As the post-war pattern unfolded, this chain of events in Germany became more and more of a piece with a larger pattern. In this book, I've tried to tell the story of an important problem and some of the things that happened when we tried to deal with it. Though many of the events occurred in Germany, before and during the military occupation, they seemed in an increasing degree to be echoes of something more fundamental that was happening back in the United States. For whatever reason, the larger pattern is a repetition of what followed after World War I, but the pace has been quicker, as though greater powers were moving more rapidly toward a more catastrophic result. Some people assume that everything is somehow connected with the Cold War, and that any other course than the one we're pursuing has been rendered impossible by disagreements with Russia. This is surely an oversimplification. Disagreements with Russia have been a major issue for only 20 or 30 years, whereas the pattern I've traced in this book has been unfolding for a much longer period. If this work has any lasting value, acknowledgement is due to the men and women who staffed the economic warfare section of the Department of Justice and the de-cartelization branch of military government, and whose reports of their researches and investigations brought together the fabric of this story. Mention should also be made of the many factual materials furnished to us in Germany by the Foreign Funds Control Division of the Treasury Department and the Finance Division of Military Government. James Stewart Martin, Annapolis, Maryland, June 6, 1950. Part 1. Private Worlds. Chapter 1. The Fraternity House. The day I started to write this, we discovered termites in the basement. We were preparing to build a wing on our old house and found a colony of them in the heavy timbers. Termites are able organizers and thoroughly attached to their way of life. The area they occupy is small in relation to the house, just the heavy underpinnings. They object vigorously to outside interference from the people who live in the other parts of the house. They object especially to structural changes, which they're bound to consider unwarranted. They have two good reasons for objecting to changes. In the first place, exposure to light and air kills them. In the second place, any movement of the underpinnings ruins the whole structure of tunnels and channels which their enterprise is built within the framework of the house. We hated to disturb them. They looked busy and enterprising. They seemed to want nothing more than a comfortable existence in accordance with their way of life. We cleared the termites out to save the house, but I think I know how they looked at the whole matter. At the end of the Second World War, I spent 2.5 years in Germany dealing with some people who must think pretty much the same way. My story goes back to 1938, when I was a lawyer recently turned college professor. I was serving as general counsel and treasurer, as well as teaching at St. John's College in Annapolis, the Great Books College. Between reading the famous list of 100 great books and untangling the college finances, I found only occasional opportunities for the pastime of studying international affairs and the movements of international business. Certainly, I had no intention at the time of becoming actively involved with international monopolies or with the Germans who backed World War II. My introduction to the specific problem of the German cartels was casual, almost accidental. On my infrequent days off, I usually took a busman's holiday and went to Washington to listen to arguments in the Supreme Court or to visit friends, most of whom were government lawyers. Washington was a happy place in 1938, except for a lawyer's usual concern to keep the details of pending cases confidential. The exchange of fact and opinion between citizens and public servant was normal. The talk with my friends was about law. I swapped stories about our troubles in carrying $500,000 in debts without throwing the college into bankruptcy for stories about their troubles in enforcing the Securities Exchange Act and the antitrust laws. Throughout this period, there were occasional rumblings in the press from Thurman Arnold, who was complaining about the international affairs of some American corporations. These companies were often mentioned in connection with the German Dyestuffs and Chemical Trust, formed about 12 years earlier, known as the IG Farben Industry. Other foreign companies, too, were mentioned. Most of them would have been familiar to constant readers of the financial pages, but they were not so well known among the general public as their American counterparts would be. Later on, during the war, the subject of private international arrangements among business firms, especially when they took the form of cartel agreements, got a considerable amount of public attention. But in those earlier days it was different. Many people could see no important principle at stake when the government announced some new antitrust suit against a group of American and foreign firms. On the surface, these international cases appeared to be no different from any other government lawsuit, such as one involving a monopoly of Wisconsin cheese or California hardwood. At first, the only remarkable feature of the operations encountered in the international cases was their size and scope. Even judging from the brief summaries and dispatches from Washington, something in the giant stature of the companies involved, some hint of the vast sweep of their arrangements, reminded one of an ancient Greek epic. I began to piece together a story from a growing collection of newspaper clippings. The cases Arnold and his men were talking about had to do with a series of arrangements dating back for a decade or so to 1926 and 1929, when international agreements among some of the biggest American, British, and German firms had quietly divided up the world. What I heard and read of these antitrust cases, and the new sort of international brotherhood they implied, a business brotherhood more solidly built than the international finance of past generations, began to bring other events closer to home. In mid-March 1939, when a group of some of the largest British and German industrialists gathered at Dusseldorf to map plans for the economic collaboration between their two countries, the press barely reported the meetings. I might have skipped the news item entirely had I not been already familiar with the subject matter. It was impossible to overlook the fact that the industrialists who were meeting at Dusseldorf were from the same groups of companies which 10 years earlier had arranged the three-way split of the world's markets. The growing conviction that these private international arrangements were important was brought to a head by my encounter with the German ex-chancellor, Heinrich Brüning, early in 1940, during the period of the Phoney War. St. John's College invited Dr. Brüning to give a lecture about the last days of the German Republic and how he had been deposed to make way for Hitler. His lecture was largely a description, by hindsight, of his own blindness during the time he was chancellor. Dr. Brüning's story was one of being always a step behind the events. By his own account, he never knew what hit him until after he had been deposed and was hiding out in the mountains of Austria, while gangs of Nazis combed the countryside looking for him. He spent his days reading, and for the first time understanding Thucydides' classic history of the Peloponnesian War, a work that generations of British diplomats have used for a teething ring, and that Dr. Breuning had carried with him from his early youth. As he reread Thucydides' story of ancient power struggles, he suddenly began to realize what forces had been combined against him in Germany, how, under the pressure of administration, he had assented to decrees that weakened the equal protection of the laws, and how large-scale economic forces had made inevitable some developments he had tried to stem by voluntary agreements among business interests. Even in the retelling, however, it seemed to me that Dr. Breuning again showed some of his former blindness. The main point in Thucydides' history was the discovery of the large part that economic forces play in bringing nations into conflict. Yet, even when pressed by questions, Dr. Breuning showed no particular concern over the role of the large German industrial corporations. He related the entire story of Franz von Pappen's intrigues, his posting of gunmen to prevent Breuning from seeing the aging von Hindenburg and the other events of the last days, without once alluding to von Pappen's conferences with the bankers and the Rhineland industrialists who agreed to back Hitler, and who put up the funds. It was, throughout, a story of politics without economics, a story of a man who had felt that no harm could come from temporary dictatorship, so long as the laws and the courts protected civil rights, who showed no feeling for the ways in which great economic power and unlimited funds could get around an inconvenient legalism. In Dr. Breuning's view, it was the refusal of groups like the German wine growers to improve their export markets that had curtailed Germany's export trade and intensified the Depression. His talk would be comparable to an American's blaming an economic depression in the United States on the activities of the Farm Bureau Federation, with scarcely a word about our industrial firms or the level of industrial employment. This was quite puzzling. In view of all that had happened in the preceding 7 years, I knew that before he was ousted, Dr. Breuning's political enemies had called him the IG Chancellor, a suggestion that the gentlemen of IG Farben Industry had got pretty much what they wanted under his administration. Yet the man himself was far from presenting the appearance of a person likely to be influenced by, or to have much influence with, big business. He looked a great deal like Woodrow Wilson. He had risen to the chancellorship from the post of Minister of Education, not from the board of the Deutsche Bank. Even his manner was Wilsonian, a combination of professorial bewilderment and amazed indignation at the way the world goes. This man, who had been at the top in Germany when Hitler's Nazi program was put across, had seen too little at the time to plan any counterstrokes. Later, sitting in a mountain hideout and reading an intelligent account of an ancient Greek war, he had felt the stirrings of an awareness. Things unknown to him at the time, things he had not even heard about, had been moving under his feet. In the end, they had dethroned him and plunged his country and the world into a major catastrophe. Yet still later, in looking back on the events, he seemed to be missing the point. I thought at the time that I might be just seeing ghosts. It was too easy to draw parallels between what had happened economically in Germany and what could be happening in the United States. Thurman Arnold seemed to be saying, sometimes patiently, but more often with an emphasis reminiscent of Donald Duck, that great forces were at work through the channels of what we in the United States had regarded as ordinary business. Arnold was charging that some of the transactions of ordinary business had crippled productive power in the United States, regardless of the motives that prompted the individual deals. If Arnold was right, there was something of serious general concern in the private arrangements made in the 20s and 30s among American, British, and German industrialists. Yet Arnold's boss, Attorney General Francis Biddle, did not appear to be impressed by the noise Arnold was making. By 1941, it seemed even that Biddle had become resentful of Arnold's constant baying. A newspaper column by Thomas L. Stokes hinted that Arnold and Biddle had clashed over the investigation of international agreements between Sterling Products, Inc., the drug firm, and Germany's I.G. Farben. Stokes said that Thomas G. Corcoran, late of the Roosevelt Brain Trust, acting as attorney for the Sterling Company, headed by Corcoran's brother, had prevailed upon the Attorney General to quash an antitrust prosecution and to accept a consent decree instead. This legal move took government investigators out of the files of the Sterling firm and closed the curtain on the details of what had been going on between Sterling and Farben, in return for the Sterling Company's promise to clean house and behave in the future. The newspaper stories of the Sterling case were fragmentary. They stated only that a business arrangement between the two companies had allowed the German firm to keep a tight grip on its overseas markets in Latin America during the war, in spite of a tight British naval blockade. By arrangements between Germany's Farben Trust and the Sterling firm, drugs manufactured in the United States had been shipped in bulk to Farben agencies in Latin America. These German agencies labeled the drugs made in Germany and kept right on supplying their customers while they laughed at the British blockade. Early in 1942, Washington announced the creation of a new agency to deal with the economic side of the war. The Board of Economic Warfare, consisting of several members of the cabinet under the chairmanship of the vice president, was to have jurisdiction over this agency, which would have a variety of duties connected with economic warfare. The idea of economic warfare seemed simple enough. Germany and Japan were enemy nations. To produce war materials and to keep their people alive, they had to get some kinds of goods from territory outside the areas their armies controlled. To keep them from getting these items, the nations on our side could resort in the first instance to naval blockade. Beyond blockades, there were the possibilities of buying up scarce commodities to keep them out of enemy hands, or of persuading non-belligerents not to sell to the enemy. These activities would, of course, connect up with the Air Force's strategic bombing of important production facilities in enemy territory, the attempt to undermine enemy war production by knocking out key factories. One night in February 1942, I had a phone call from Edward H. Levy, one of the members of Thurman Arnold's staff. He asked me to leave my post at St. John's College and take a position as special assistant to the Attorney General. I was to help organize a unit in the Department of Justice to work with the newly created Board of Economic Warfare. Soon after the board was set up, Milo Perkins, its executive director, had written to the Attorney General asking for reports on the international business ties between American firms and firms in enemy territory, wherever these ties could be expected to work to the advantage of the enemy. Also, Mr. Perkins had asked for any information that would give details of industrial plants and industrial production in Germany and Japan. Such information would be useful to the Air Force, as well as the Board of Economic Warfare. A short time later, in conversations with Johnston Avery, administrative assistant to Thurman Arnold, I found out more of the details and agreed to join the team. I worked with members of the Antitrust Division in setting up in the Department of Justice the Economic Warfare Section, of which I finally became chief. We set up field offices in principal cities, the largest part of the staff being maintained at New York, where Robert Walforth headed some 20 or 30 lawyers and investigators. Our object was to test the possibilities of viewing the enemy through the chinks and loopholes of international business arrangements. Once we knew which American companies had agreements with which Japanese or German companies, we knew where to find engineers and technicians who had visited, and in some cases even had drawn the blueprints for plants making synthetic rubber, synthetic gasoline, tetraethyl lead, precision ball bearings, and the like. This kind of reporting became known as bombing work, and we found ourselves quickly dubbed the Bottleneck Boys. Air intelligence wanted to find out as much as possible about the industry in all areas where the air forces might be operating. They wanted to know the relative importance of different plants, partly to help plan the targets for bombing missions, and partly to help in figuring out what they had hit after the raid was over. We had neither the staff nor the facilities to make sweeping economic studies of German industries, but we could find out from men who ought to know which plants producing what materials were likely to be the bottlenecks in German production. We had no way of knowing where all the coal mines or steel plants in Germany were, but we did find out that by agreement among the biggest producers of precision anti-friction bearings, practically all such bearings of any importance in Germany were made in only 3 factories, grouped around the railway yards in Schweinfurt. We could not locate all the gasoline refineries, but we did find out that there were only 3 plants equipped to make the tetraethyl lead, which is necessary for high-octane aviation gasoline. And we found a man who could draw pictures of all 3. We did not know where to locate all of the mills producing brass for cartridge cases, but one of our men did find out that there were only 2 ways of making the special high-grade zinc that goes into this type of brass, both ways being the subject of patents, and he found blueprints and diagrams of all plants in Germany capable of making this zinc by consulting the files of 2 American companies. While other agencies hired economists and technicians to lay out large studies of the German industrial economy, our men interviewed men from DuPont, Standard Oil, International Telephone and Telegraph, Anaconda Copper, General Motors, General Electric, and investment bankers and other businessmen who had been to Germany on what turned out to be bottleneck deals. As we worked on the search for bottlenecks in German production, we began to find a close relation between international business agreements for the restriction of production and the kinds of products which were especially critical in wartime. The trouble was that these international arrangements, which pointed up the importance of certain commodities in the German economy, had also resulted in restriction of production in the United States. Arnold's men found that one company, Rome and Haas of Philadelphia, was not able itself to produce enough transparent plastic sheets for bomber noses. But because Rome and Haas of Philadelphia had DuPont under a special agreement, as part of a more complex and wider 4-way arrangement involving DuPont and 2 German firms, IG Farben Industry and Rome and Haas of Darmstadt, DuPont was permitted to turn out only a limited quantity of the plastic sheets. While government expediters were tearing their hair out over slow deliveries, DuPont was writing to Rome and Haas of Philadelphia that they would have to tell the government about the agreement, unless Rome and Haas would lift the restriction. We discovered even more spectacular complications, such as those in the 3-way arrangement among the aircraft equipment firms, Bendix of the United States, Siemens of Germany, and Zenith in England. Under one of these arrangements, the American firm in 1941 had stood by an agreement with the Siemens firm of Germany and forbade British Zenith to grant patent licenses, so that the British Air Ministry could expand production of aircraft carburetors. Almost a year after Dunkirk, Zenith wrote to Bendix that the ministry suggested they would prefer to manufacture the carburetors themselves and asked us to waive all our rights in this matter. We've told them plainly that we are not prepared under any circumstances to agree to this or to alter one item of our contract with you. You know that we have got to win the war if we're going to survive, and it is because we know we shall win and survive that we are anxious that post-war business should not be complicated by departing from the conditions of the contract in the meantime and under the excuse of war conditions. As the war went on, Senate committees probing production bottlenecks in the United States helped to compile and make public the records of a staggering number of similar arrangements, differing in detail but all having the same effect. They were widely denounced, but principally on the ground that they represented business as usual during wartime. Editorials solemnly pronounced that all such arrangements should be out for the duration. These business arrangements operated at focal points, where it was possible to turn on and off the main valves in economic pipelines. It was not long before we found that the arrangement of valves and pipelines was a two-way affair. Our elation at the discovery that practically all of Germany's fine optical glass came from one factory, the Schott Works at Jena, was counteracted by the discovery that, under the same working arrangement, only one such factory of any importance existed in the United States. The pinpoint for bombing in Germany could be the blueprint for sabotage in the United States. As if to add point to such thoughts about sabotage, during the summer of 1942, the Justice Building in Washington played host to the trial of 8 Nazi saboteurs who had been landed by submarine to blow up some of the key factories in the United States. Morning and evening, the black vans of the United States Marshal trundled the prisoners under our windows, and all day long the drawn blinds on a row of windows 2 stories up and across the courtyard were a reminder that sabotage in the literal sense of the term was not just a theoretical possibility. But sabotage in its literal sense was not the point. As our piecemeal reports stacked up, a picture began to emerge of an enemy that did not need the services of trained professional spies and saboteurs. By agreement between German and American producers of magnesium needed for aircraft, production in the United States before the war was limited to no more than 5,000 tons per year. In contrast, Germany in 1939 alone used 13,500 tons, and during the next 5 years consumed magnesium at the rate of 33,000 tons per year. Here was a case where American business is business men had knowingly or unknowingly helped a German firm to close some valves over here, with far more effect than the 8 saboteurs could ever have achieved, even if they had been allowed to do their utmost. Plants which have never been built are more dead than plants which have been bombed. A bombed plant may still live in its blueprints and in the trained labor force that had been operating it. As the evidence piled up to show German success in negotiating restrictive arrangements, the contrast between the limited possibilities of cloak-and-dagger sabotage and the greater possibilities of safely negotiated business arrangement became more and more heavily underlined with each passing of the Black Mariahs under our windows. Unfortunately, Francis Biddle and Thurman Arnold were still like stiff-legged fighting roosters with each other. Some of Biddle's public remarks, including humorous references to the bombing work of Arnold and his boys, seemed to confirm our impression that the Attorney General considered what we were doing to be the product of a somewhat amusing mental aberration. Finally, combined pressure from the War and Navy departments and the War Production Board prevailed in suspending the enforcements of the antitrust laws for the duration of the war, in all cases affecting industries considered important to the war effort. All that was necessary to stop an investigation or the prosecution of a case was a certification from Robert B. Patterson, Undersecretary of War, James V. Forrestal, Undersecretary of the Navy, and John Lord O'Brien, General Counsel of the War Production Board, that any attempt to press the case would interfere with the war effort. This signaled the end of Thurman Arnold's great trust-busting drive. A short time later, Arnold allowed himself to be kicked upstairs. He accepted an appointment as judge of the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. With Arnold's departure, The Attorney General showed signs of more serious interest in the evidence of how the German program of economic warfare had been carried out. Biddle called for more and more thumbnail sketches of what we were discovering. By the spring of 1944, the time came to add up the score. In 3 years, with a staff of less than 60 people, we had prepared 3,600 of these snapshots of German economic power in action. But the Attorney General wanted to know the conclusions of all these findings. We began to summarize our picture of an enemy that could survive a military defeat because it did not need or use military weapons. This enemy did survive military defeat after World War I. We had in front of us the story of what lay behind the Ruhr occupation of 1923, the runaway German inflation, the Dawes and Young plans, the Dillon, Reed, and the Schroeder bond issues, the growth of the Ruhr as the industrial heart of Europe, Germany's strange obsession with heavy industry at the expense of consumer goods, guns not butter. As we summarized these findings, the Attorney General took more and more interest, became fascinated, began to speak in favor of doing something to prevent it all from happening again. He talked to President Roosevelt. In the fall of 1944, the president wanted some of these findings publicized to pave the way for serious post-war policies to deal with the problem. He wrote his famous letter of September 6, 1944, to Secretary of State Hull. The history of the use of the I.G. Farben Trust by the Nazis reads like a detective story. Defeat of the Nazi armies will have to be followed by the eradication of these weapons of economic warfare. We had started out to get a picture of our military enemy, and had found a much bigger enemy of a quite different sort from the popular picture of hobnailed Nazis with guns and tanks. Late in the summer of 1944, Francis Biddle, the man who 3 years before had found nothing very important in the Sterling Products case, and who 2 years before had been amused by Thurman Arnold's bombardment of Germany, told a Senate committee what he thought must be done during the occupation of Germany. As we approach the occupation of Germany, we will have to decide what is to be done with the great German monopolistic firms. These are the firms that made the contracts in which we are interested. The period between the wars was only an armistice during which the firms of Germany conducted war against us. The British representative on the Inter-Allied Commission supervising German disarmament stated in a lecture in 1923, "We in this country flatter ourselves that the war ended on January 10, 1920. A future generation may yet describe the period in which we are living as an armistice, during which the war was continued by other methods than rifle and howitzer, only to be resumed in all its carnal horror after the lapse of a few ambiguous years." These firms, in reality, operated as departments of the German government. They evaded and violated the peace treaties in order to build up Germany's military strength. It was the theory of the German government that operating under the guise of ordinary commercial arrangements, these firms could be used to weaken Europe and America, so that when the military war was resumed, we would lose. Through the techniques of industrial penetration, they hoped to be able to cripple American production, to gain from us technical know-how, to conduct espionage upon us, and to establish centers of propaganda throughout the world. The shadow of the Sterling case moved across Mr. Biddle's account. Sterling had taken over the American Bayer Company after World War I, and it was what Sterling and I.G. Farben had agreed to do with the business of American Bayer that had been the nub of the Sterling Products case in 1941. Mr. Biddle in 1944 told the Senate committee, "I.G. Farben Industry is the principal combine which has been used by the German government to attempt to restrict American production. It is the successor to the German Die Trust, which attempted, prior to the last war, to keep an independent American industry from developing. The president of the American Bayer Company, which was owned by the German Die Trust, was told by his German superiors that his accomplishments in holding down American production before the last war could be compared to the work of an army leader who had succeeded in destroying 3 railroad trains of 40 cars containing 4.5 million pounds of explosives. After amplifying these conclusions with further facts, he pounded home his point. I hope, as the years go by, we will not forget, not because I wish to have individual American companies condemned, but because these things should not be permitted to happen again. It is the system under which Germany was able to make these cartel agreements that must be broken up. At the present time, it is probably inaccurate to speak of separate combines or cartels in the German economy. They are all linked together. The munition makers, the potash industry, the machine trust, the oil industry, the electrical manufacturers, the steel trust, and the chemical companies. They exist as part of the Nazi government. We may expect, however, that when the government falls, they will appear again as separate combines. The companies which were used as instruments to violate the peace treaties, to dominate industry in Europe, to support the Nazi war machine, and to restrict production here, will then appear in the guise of ordinary commercial firms. The Attorney General put his finger on the gist of what we had learned when he underscored the fact that the pattern of the activity of these firms was established before the Nazis came to power and during the early days of the German Republic. The German government and the German people as a whole have never accepted the doctrines of economic liberalism which run through American industry. The monopolistic firms of Germany have survived in that country through 2 wars and constitute a definite menace to the future peace of the world. As long as they survive in their present form, it will be exceedingly difficult to develop independent industry in Europe outside of Germany. He called for action. I propose that we break the power of the German monopolistic firms. The purpose of such a program would not be to destroy German economic life in its entirety, but to put its industries into a form where they will no longer constitute a menace to the civilized world. I do not underestimate the difficulties involved in such a program. Such a program cannot be worked out in any definite form on paper, and at this distance from the field of operations, it will have to wait the period of supervision over these companies that should come during the occupation period. But this is a procedure which we did not follow after the last war. It will not be followed in this war, unless we make up our minds to do it now and prepare for it. We must have some picture of what this complicated industrial interconnection is, when, after Germany has been conquered, we sit down and say, what will we do to break up this industrial domination? Chapter 2. The Termites. The Battle of the Bulge was just over. The German juggernaut was grinding to a stop for the 3rd time since 1870. There was still the possibility that the Nazis would pull out all the horrors of poison gas and bacteriological warfare for a Wagnerian finale. Looking ahead to the end of the shooting war, nearly everyone wanted to know what could be done to keep Germans from starting the same kind of thing all over again. The United States was in a mood to propose new ideas. This was true especially on the economic side of international relations, where so many troubles begin. We were tired of trade barriers, restrictions, nations playing their cards close to the chest. We were becoming a little ashamed of having farm surpluses and industrial overproduction in one part of the world, while people starved and did without things in other parts. The tremendous wartime production in our own country, outstripping all estimates, had itself been an eye-opener. Why not have full production and full employment in peacetime, too? We were beginning to have some feeling for the idea that economic restrictions, depression, and war are not unrelated. Francis Biddle's demand for curbs on the big German financial and industrial combines was not ignored. The financial branch of SHAEF, General Eisenhower's headquarters in Europe, asked for help in planning the necessary steps. They were preparing to investigate the concentration of economic power in Germany. They wanted to discover how the German leaders were smuggling great fortunes abroad to provide a future base of operations after the coming military defeat. With the approval of the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Treasury, a few of us were formed into a small team sent over jointly from the Economic Warfare Section of the Department of Justice and the Foreign Funds Control Division of the Treasury Department to help the financial branch. I was in charge of the Department of Justice contingent. It was going to be our job to uncover records and to find and talk to the German masterminds who had laid their plans for turning military defeat into economic victory. We had to find out what they had done and how they had done it. This was no job of criminal investigation. That would be for the war crimes staff. We would not be concerned directly with the intentions or the good or bad faith of the handful of Germans who had shaped the building of Hitler's new order. Neither would we be concerned with the good faith or patriotism of their helpers in other countries. The men who turned the policy of France before 1940 toward economic collaboration with the Third Reich have never admitted that they intended digging a grave for France. The men of the Federation of British Industries, who in March 1939 at Dusseldorf worked out a plan of economic collaboration with the Reichsgruppe industry, have denied any intention of helping to set the stage for war. Even the German bankers and industrialists who called in Hitler to bolster their tottering financial empires later denied any intention to produce what followed. Whatever their story might be, we had to know how such men came to have power and what forces determined the use they made of it. Sitting on the management boards of 6 large banks and 70 huge industrial combines and holding companies, fewer than 100 men controlled over 2/3 of Germany's industrial system. Their international ties gave them a central location within the framework of European heavy industry and finance. Long before the war, these companies and their relations to one another had set the economic pattern for most of Europe. During the German occupation of the neighboring countries, they had had new opportunities to strengthen their hold. Even before we left the United States, it took no powers of divination to realize that German finance and industry would have made the most of these opportunities to set up new vested interests in hands that would appear to be French or Dutch or Belgian or Italian. We could expect to be greeted by these allied defenders of the Nazi economic new order, who would resist our countermeasures by wailing that they had already suffered under the Germans. It would have been hard to maintain any illusion about the job ahead. Finding out what to do would be bad enough. Getting different agencies of our own government to recognize an unfamiliar danger and agree on a course of action might be something else. We'd already been through a preview of such difficulties in dealing with a case that came up early in the war. I was reminded of it just as we were leaving for Europe. On a bleak night in February 1945, I found myself standing with my small party of investigators in the mist at the Washington airport, waiting to take off. As I stood in the gloom, observing all the security measures that shrouded our routine departure, the blackout of the field and plane, the silence, the sudden orders, I remembered our discovery earlier in the war of how easily the secrecy of ship sailings had been penetrated by the Germans. In 1940, 1941, and 1942, Ships leaving American seaports had had the same security measures to protect their departure, yet many of their broken hulls and water-soaked cargoes had washed up onto the beaches of New Jersey, Virginia, and the Carolinas, where German submarines had spotted them within sight of shore. In case after case, every man on board had been marked before the captain opened his orders. Though they may not have known it, the cargoes they carried were reinsured with Munich. Their routine system of placing insurance had put precise information on their sailing date and destination in the hands of the Germans before the ship left port. In the summer of 1941, before there was any economic warfare section, several trust busters discovered that while the American public was looking more and more askance at German business connections, insurance companies doing an international business seemed to have no such doubts about their foreign commitments. Insurers of large risks such as ships, cargoes, and industrial plants customarily spread the risk among other companies willing to take fractional shares. The big insurance and reinsurance companies in the United States, which handle the largest risks, have such treaties on an international basis through arrangements with the Lloyd's Group in England or with the Zurich Group in Switzerland. It had long been the custom of the American companies to place the reinsurance on ships and cargoes with the Zurich Group by cabling information to them so that they could accept responsibility for a share of the American insurer's risk. The information cabled would include the name of the ship, the sailing date, the cargo carried, the destination, and the value of the insured property. One detail that should have raised someone's eyebrow, but did not until the government stepped in, was the fact that the Zurich Group in turn had a reinsurance treaty with the Munich reinsurance pool in Germany. The result was that during 1940 and early 1941, by the time a ship had cleared New York or Baltimore Harbor, headed for a European port, the German intelligence service already had the sailing data in hand. When men from the Department of Justice called a conference of insurance representatives, the companies agreed to stop sending such information by cable. But even then, no one realized what an efficient pipeline the Germans had set up. It appeared later that everyone concerned, both government officials and insurance men, assumed that sending the information by mail to Switzerland would be perfectly all right. Nothing was said about stopping completely the transmission of reinsurance information. In the spring of 1942, after we had started to set up the economic warfare section, we found that reinsurance information sheets, or bordereaux, were still going to Switzerland by mail. We also discovered that the reinsurance business, far from being confined to ships and cargoes, also covered industrial plants, and more especially those very large new plants being built for war production, the ones with security guards at the gates, to see that no unauthorized eyes got inside. In the case of industrial plants, we found that the reinsurance bordereau did not account for the full extent of the leakage. The usual reinsurance treaty on such risks provides that the reinsurance group has the right to demand copies of a full report by the insurance inspector. This includes blueprints of the installation, description of the fire hazards and risks, and inventory of the contents of the building, room by room. We found that before 1938, the Zurich Group had asked for the full insurance inspector's report in only 5 or 6% of the cases. After 1938, the full report was requested with increasing frequency, until the percentage was closer to 90. It had seemed obvious to us that the government ought to stop this transmission of shipping and industrial information through Switzerland to the Reich. Unlike the United States, the German government, as early as 1936, had closed off such information about Germany. As soon as the Germans occupied France, Belgium, and Holland in 1940, they put a stop to all such transmissions from those countries. We proposed to have the Attorney General send a letter to each company, warning that transmission of marine and industrial plant information of this type came within the scope of the Espionage Act. Issuance of such a letter in the name of the Attorney General, however, required approval by the Solicitor General, Charles Fahey. Mr. Fahey would not take this responsibility without consulting the other interested departments of the government. At first, no one could believe that Americans were handling the German intelligence service information on a silver platter. At one of Mr. Fahey's interdepartmental meetings, Joseph Borken, then of the Antitrust Division, slapped down on the table a stack of insurance inspectors' reports on various prominent buildings. He had purchased these from sources open to anyone in the insurance business, without any special security clearance. For 55 cents, he had the plans of the White House, showing the location of fire extinguishers and other protective apparatus. For 75 cents, he had the plans for a large new magnesium plant. One of the blueprints had an arrow pointing at a valve with the legend, "Under no circumstances must this valve be closed while the plant is in operation, as an explosion would result." To complete our case, we had obtained from the Office of Censorship copies of Insurance Bordereau, photographed from the current week's mail, destined for Switzerland. We got other evidence to show that German insurance companies were operating at a loss in Latin America, with the help of a German government subsidy, to capture a larger share of the international reinsurance business at the same time, to show how informative inspection reports could be to an outsider. Another of our men got from the files of American reinsurance firms similar data on important European plants, such as the N.V. Philips lamp and radio tube factories at Eindhoven, Holland. Months later, the British Ministry of Economic Warfare thanked us profusely for copies of this report, even though it was dated 1939. They told us it had been used in planning the RAF raid on Eindhoven in December 1942 and in assessing the bomb damage after the raid. Still, there were objections. Maritime Commission representatives argued that existing regulations required them to place insurance on all cargo. If we put any brakes on the insurance companies, they might decline to accept the risks, and ship sailings would be delayed. Besides, enemy agents could get information on ship sailings and cargo by going down to the docks and watching the ships load and depart. The FBI resented the implication that enemy agents had the run of the waterfront. Nearly everyone in the end agreed there was no sense in wrapping up marine and industrial information and handing it to the Germans, but the Maritime Commission was still worried about the possibility of not getting insurance placed before ships were ready to sail. Other agencies were bothered about industrial plant insurance. For months, they urged us to look for a solution that would permit the insurance business to be carried on as usual. Why not set up an interdepartmental committee of qualified economists and experts to sit in consultation with members of the insurance industry? They could pass upon specific items of information, deciding in each case whether the release of the information would substantially harm the war effort or give help to the enemy. We stuck to our guns and insisted that the simplest thing to do was to tell the insurance companies that this particular practice had to stop. Let the people in the business, who were already familiar with conditions in their industry, figure out how they could adjust themselves to the new circumstances. We felt that government, wherever possible, should operate through laws, not by setting up more and more administrative tribunals to command or forbid particular acts. We pointed out that the Lloyds Group had solved a similar problem by sending over from England a resident representative with power of attorney to make commitments on behalf of the British companies without sending information out of the United States. Our stand for a government of laws, not men, got no support from the Solicitor General. Mr. Fahey overruled us again, and discussions continued on how to set up an interdepartmental screening committee. After several months of this, Even men from the insurance business began to ask the Attorney General to send his letter so that they could get the bureaucrats out of their hair. In the end, the letter was sent out, nearly a year and a half after the leakage had first been brought to the attention of an agency of the government, and over 4 months after we in the economic warfare section had taken up the case and pointed out what uses the Germans could be making of the information. Actually, the Germans made plenty of use of it. Nearly 3 years later, in the summer of 1945, in the files of the Munich Reinsurance Company and the German Intelligence Service, we were to find bundles of photographs, blueprints, and detailed descriptions of whole industrial developments in the United States, many of them obtained through insurance channels. Together, they made up the vital statistics of our war economy. Nothing was ever done to restrict the circulation of insurance inspectors' reports within the industry inside the United States. A few weeks after Joe Borkin made his dramatic purchases, an FBI agent appeared at Borkin's office in the Justice Building and demanded to know why Joe, who was not in the insurance business, had been buying up this type of information. The FBI, with its attention focused on security of information about war plans, had seen nothing unusual until someone outside the insurance field showed an interest in information that was freely accessible to anyone in the business. Like the characters in the Chesterton story, who failed to suspect the mailman, even the G-men had a blind spot for security leaks that occur in what is regarded as the normal course of business. This reminder of how hard it can be to warn others about a new kind of danger was a disturbing thought as we prepared that February night in 1945 to take off for Europe. How were we going to fare when we ran up against real demonstrations of German economic power and ingenuity, where the opposition to change would be a lot more formidable because it would be carefully engineered? The answer was not long in coming. We settled down out of the sky over England into a fog-covered beehive called Bushy Park, headquarters for the future military government of Germany, then known as the U.S. Group Control Council. Brigadier General Cornelius W. Wickersham was in command, and it was on our way to report to him that we got our first forewarning of opposition to come. Together with Norman Bursler and Alexander Sachs, I was walking through the hall of a temporary wooden office building when Alex pointed to the name of Colonel Graham K. Howard over the office door of the director of the Economics Division. Howard was the author of a book written in 1940 before the United States entered the war, called America and a New World Order, an apologia for the Nazi economic system that might just as well have been titled You Can Do Business with Hitler. Now it looked as though we were to be working with him, and with others like him, in an effort to reconstitute Germany on a new pattern. Colonel Howard was only the first of many who turned up, riding into Germany with the future military government, helping to deflect the policy back into old grooves. Colonel Howard, it is true, was straightaway relieved of his duties before we left Bushy Park for the continent. In fact, just after General Wickersham received a copy of his book from the Intelligence Division. But trick pennies are the same on both sides. The position of Economic Director was filled by the assignment from Washington of Brigadier General William H. Draper, Jr., on military leave from his position as Secretary-Treasurer of Dillon, Reed and Company. This investment banking firm after World War I had taken the lead in floating the German bonds, which put German industry in a position to fight another war. The men with whom Colonel Howard had already staffed the Economics Division clearly wanted the occupation of Germany to be carried out along quite different lines from those decided upon by the government departments at Washington. Coordination between the plans of the Economics Division and the policies laid down by Washington became more and more difficult. The constant carping and the mounting criticism of the official policies became so open that General Wickersham finally found it necessary to issue a formal order to all officers under his command, requiring them to stop their criticism and to support and advocate the policies laid down in the Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive. Our special team was assigned to work in the Finance Division with Captain Norbert A. Bogdan, a charming fellow who had been a vice president of the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, a firm in whose files the Nazi banking affiliations were still warm when the United States went to war. It was a bit of a relief to learn that our connection was to be only temporary, and that because of the rather fluid state of our mission, we could soon move over to Versailles and be assigned to SHAEF, SHAEF. There, I was asked to prepare a staff study that resulted in General Eisenhower sending out a major policy cable, designated SCAF 239, to the combined Chiefs of Staff in Washington, stating that he considered it necessary to investigate further the flight of capital assets, which German industrialists were spiriting out of the country to escape seizure. Then, even before the reply came back, SHAEF sent out another cable, this time to the War Department, announcing that in advance of approval of the whole program by the combined Chiefs of Staff, our small team of investigators was being sent into the field. SHAEF asked for additional qualified personnel to be sent over from Washington to join us. Our next problem was to map out our moves to follow those of the armies. Since we were civilians attached to SHAEF, each of our movements into operational territory had to be cleared down the chain of command, like a pinball looking for the jackpot through army group to army, and sometimes even to the particular corps and division in charge of the area we wanted to cover. We studied the top-secret operational plans and their allocation of geographical objectives to different army groups. We projected our movements so that the centers of our investigations would fall one after the other along the line of advance of a particular army group. Most of our investigating in the end was carried out in General Bradley's 12th and Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group areas. Chapter 3. The Heavy Timbers. General Eisenhower's armies between D-Day in 1944 and VE Day in 1945 slashed an incision across the body of Europe. It was radical surgery to remove what the Nazis had laid out through 7 years of contriving and 5 years of military occupation. No one who saw any part of the operation will be likely to forget how the details of life at all levels, bodies, personal effects, bathtubs, business papers, confidential government files, family skeletons, all lay exposed in the wake of combat. I remember particularly a family at Dusseldorf living on the 3rd floor of a building that had been cross-sectioned by a bomb. They always looked with some show of modesty up and down the street before stepping into their open-air bathtub. In a surprisingly short time, old habits returned. Privacy reasserted itself. Papers were gathered up and tucked away. Flowers and vines grew over debris. But for a while, there were no secrets. In those brief weeks before the incision closed, the Allied governments overlooked rights of privacy and constitutional immunities from searches and seizures. Immediately behind the blade of Eisenhower's knife came the T-forces, with their affiliated groups of specialists to search for anything and everything that would throw light on the underlying causes of Germany's military outbreaks. This determination to probe and search was typical of the never-again feeling that predominated. Allied policy in 1945 was full of solemn promises and morning-after resolutions. It would have been hard not to catch some of this spirit as we moved toward the forward areas to pick up the trail of the economic warlords. President Roosevelt had said a few months earlier that defeat of the Nazi armies would have to be followed by complete eradication of the weapons of economic warfare. After World War I, there had been the same never-again resolves, and we had already witnessed a complete cycle ending in failure. Before we left the United States, the Economic Warfare Section prepared a report which analyzed the errors of the occupation after the other World War and showed the measures that Germany had used to defeat the occupation and to play the Allies one against the other. I carried a copy of this report with me all the time I was in Germany. By mid-1947, I'd already checked off the first 20 pages, paragraph by paragraph, week by week, in a pattern of repetition. But in the beginning, in 1945, we were open-minded and sometimes even hopeful about our prospects. We knew that the economic policies for dealing with Germany had been prepared at Washington with some understanding of the ways in which reforms might be defeated. It was our intention to carry these policies along in the way that miners carry canaries to detect poison gases. We knew from the beginning of the occupation that once these economic reforms fell, other reform measures would not survive for very long. We were scarcely flying blind when we made the Ruhr our foremost objective. The struggle over the Ruhr had brought the first major breakdown of Allied policy in 1923, when Britain and the United States refused to back up the French occupation of the valley. And 10 years later, the financiers and industrialists of that area had boosted Hitler into the driver's seat. In recent years, there's been so much confused thinking and pro-German propaganda about the place of the Ruhr in the European economy that we have to keep in mind that this area is important, principally because it has very large deposits of good coking coal. Its growth as a steel center was a phenomenon of the 1920s after World War I. The Ruhr became the site of Europe's biggest steel plants, less for economic reasons than as part of a struggle for power between Germany and France. In the beginning, it was French Lorraine, and not the German Ruhr, that was the chief center of Western European heavy industry. From the time Germany took control of Alsace and Lorraine in the War of 1870, up until the end of World War I, the Germans organized the steel industry of the combined Ruhr-Lorraine area strictly on the basis of economic and technical efficiency. They designed the steel plants and coke works to maintain the best balance of transportation facilities, centers of production, and outlets for products. Under this arrangement, most of the blast furnaces were near the ore supplies of German-held Lorraine, and most of the coke works were near the coal suppliers of the German Ruhr. This saved on transportation, because in the production of pig iron, 3 tons of Lorraine ore are required for every ton of coke. However, because iron ore is very heavy and coke is light and bulky, they built a few coke works in the Lorraine, near the steel plants, and a few blast furnaces and steel works in the Ruhr near the coke plants. Thus, a mixed shipment of ore and pig iron eastward from the Lorraine to the Ruhr, and a mixture of coal and coke westward from the Ruhr to Lorraine, kept the railway trains and locomotives fully loaded in both directions. After World War I, this efficiency of production yielded in the face of a German play for power. The Versailles Treaty had required Germany to deliver to France 7 million tons of coal a year for 10 years. France depended upon a vast quantity of coal from the German Ruhr because the ore beds of Lorraine were too far from channel ports to make possible a switch to British coal. So reacquiring Lorraine meant little to France industrially, unless access to Ruhr coal went with it. In 1913, before the war, the Germans had shipped nearly 1/3 of their entire Ruhr and Rhineland coal output to the iron and steel plants of Lorraine. During 1922, although the Ruhr output was approximately the same as it had been in 1913, the deliveries to France were not even 70% of the 1913 shipments. And that was the peak year. In 1919, 1920, and 1921, the deliveries totaled much less than half the 1913 deliveries. 6 months after the Treaty of Versailles went into effect, the German industrialists of the Ruhr and Rhineland had completely repudiated the delivery of fuel as reparations. A special conference was called, to work out a new agreement. At the Spa Conference of July 5, 1920, the Allied negotiators faced a battery of German representatives who were destined to figure prominently in the economic debacle of the late 1920s and in the support of Hitler's rise to power. In addition to the coal magnate Hugo Stinnes and Karl Bosch, slated to head the huge new IG Farben chemical combine, these leaders included Fritz Thyssen and his emergency committee of 5 other Ruhr industrialists, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, and 4 other Krupp directors, Albert Vogler, Director General of the Stinnes concern and member of the Reichstag, and 2 other noteworthy steel magnates, Florian Kluckner of the Kluckner Combine, and Otto Wolff, head of the Phoenix Works and the Otto Wolff Complex. In retrospect, it was a who's who in the rise of the Nazis. The Germans were ingenious in their explanation of why they could not ship more coal. They said they had to have some way of getting enough money out of it to hasten their economic recovery. Actually, their financial distress was not caused by a lack of material goods inside Germany, but by the monetary inflation. The inflation had been given a shot in the arm when the German government, at the insistence of the Ruhr industrialists, paid out hundreds of millions of marks as indemnities to the iron and steel companies for their losses in ceding the Lorraine plants to the French. But no one asked the why of the inflation. German economic distress was accepted as a fact. The Germans went on to explain that they needed more food for their undernourished miners to enable them to increase production. The Allies gave in to the demands of the Germans. In the Protocol of Spa, issued at the conclusion of the conference, the Allies agreed to pay $1 in gold for every ton of fuel delivered by Germany. The purpose of this payment was to provide more food as an incentive for the Ruhr miners. This payment was in addition to sizable loans which the Allies were already required to make to Germany under the Versailles Treaty. The loans were to make up the difference between the German domestic price of coal and the prevailing export price at British seaports. At the time of the Spa Conference, this difference amounted to nearly $10 per ton, and the Allies agreed to continue advancing loans at this rate, in addition to the $1 per ton to feed the miners. Over the next 6 months, Germany received about $100 million in combined payments and loans in return for not quite 11 million tons of coal. Thus, what was nominally supposed to be reparations was in any practical sense tantamount to an ordinary sale of coal at a very good price. The shortage of coke shipments to France was not due to short production in Germany. Germany had suffered no war damage whatsoever inside its own borders during World War I. On the other hand, much of the iron-producing territory reacquired by France had been the scene of the bitterest fighting of the war. More people know Verdun as a battlefield than as a steel center. Nevertheless, it was the breakdown of German deliveries of coke to France, not failure of the French to rebuild their factories, that stopped French iron and steel production after 1920. The German Ruhr magnates were converting the greater part of Germany's coal production into coke for new German plants in the Ruhr. They were building an entirely new complex of iron and steel plants to replace those ceded to France after the war. The new plants in the Ruhr were to get the bulk of their ores from the high-grade deposits of Sweden, Spain, and Newfoundland. The extra costs of the long overseas haul were offset by German government subsidies and indemnities. The purpose of this German strategy was destined to become clearer as the post-war adjustments of the 1920s unfolded. During the first years after the war, when coal was scarce in Europe, the German coal producers held the whip hand over France. Since the cost of coal accounted for 3/5 of the cost of French pig iron, whoever controlled the cost of coal could control the competitive fate of French iron and steel. German coal producers, who also sat on the managing boards of the German state railways and the new steel firms, arranged exorbitantly high freight rates over the German railways from the Ruhr to the French border. At the same time, drastic cutbacks in ore importations from France produced a further temporary reversal for the French industry. The new German plants got a good head start. In spite of the relief afforded by the Protocol of Spa, the German government and industrial leaders continued to drag their feet. On January 11, 1923, 4 years after the Treaty of Versailles went into effect, coal deliveries broke down. French and Belgian troops were sent into the Ruhr to compel deliveries of coal and coke at the rate required by the treaty, which was only about 60% of what Germany had been in the habit of shipping into the same area before the war. The German coal and steel industrialists countered with new threats and demands. The German miners staged a sit-down strike to keep up production in factories outside of the occupied Ruhr area. The Germans imported British coal through the port of Hamburg. At the same time, the German government appointed a coal commissioner to conserve coal. The commissioner announced that with suitable economies, the stocks of coal in unoccupied Germany would last for nearly 6 months. Total imports of British coal into unoccupied Germany in March 1923 alone amounted to 2 million tons. On August 11, 1923, the British sent a note of protest to France, complaining that the Ruhr occupation was hampering European recovery. On August 12, 1923, Gustav Stresemann became Chancellor and Foreign Minister. To settle the matter of the Ruhr occupation, he held a conference with the same group of industrialists who, a few years later, were to take the lead in forming Germany's largest iron and steel combine, the Vereinigte Stahlwerk, or United Steel Works, with the help of loans from the United States. The question in the minds of the German industry men was how to establish a superior bargaining position before receding in the face of French insistence. One of the steelmen, Otto Wolff, stated that Germany could indeed cooperate with French industry, but that France must first place at Germany's disposal the money to help reconstruct her economic life. The occupation of the Ruhr resulted in a deadlock. The German government claimed there was no money in Germany to pay the Ruhr mine owners for the coal they were expected to ship. The mine owners lamented that they would be bankrupt if they could not obtain payment for their deliveries to France. The deadlock was broken when the United States stepped in and offered the Dawes Plan, which called for balancing the German budget and an initial loan of $200 million to stabilize the German currency. The plan was approved by the Reichstag on April 16, 1924. The delivery of reparations was resumed for a time, while the Germans moved on to the next stage of their resistance. At the very time that the Germans were protesting inability to meet reparations, the entire country was quietly rearming under the very noses of the occupying powers. After several years, when coal had again become plentiful on the European market, the German groups had already developed answering moves to block any attempt of the French or the Belgians or the Luxembourgers to compete with the new German setup. During the years of coal scarcity, the German steel producers took the lead in organizing an international association to guarantee the steel industry of each Western European nation a fixed share in the export markets for all types of steel products. In return, the steelmakers of each country agreed to limit production to a fixed quota, with cash penalties for production or exports beyond the agreed amounts. This association, known in German as the Internationale Rohstahlgemeinschaft, in French as the Entente Internationale de l'Acier, in English as the International Steel Cartel, with its offices in a stone building 2 blocks off the Grande Rue in Luxembourg, became the privately organized policing system that governed the steel trade of the world from 1926 to 1939. Within a very few years after its formation, the Germans ran the cartel and could shape its policies to meet their demands. These were some of the main steps by which a small group of German industrialists, deriving their power from ownership of coal mines, steel works, and chemical plants in Western Germany, contrived to avoid the economic consequences of Germany's defeat in World War I. It is true that the industrialists did not take matters directly into their own hands. The steps themselves had to be taken by governments. The Treaty of Versailles was an act of the Allied governments, representing their combined judgment of how the issues of World War I ought to be decided. But what actually happened after that was dictated not so much by the diplomatic treaties of governments as by the bargaining of powerful business groups. The German businessmen were interested first in their companies, not in national political obligations. The German steel companies whose Lorraine plants had been turned over to France, and the coal producers whose output was to be shipped to France, were not impressed by the argument that Germany as a nation somehow owed France, as a nation, some recompense for war damage. If they gave up their company's property for national debt, it was their balance sheets that showed the loss. The horizontal separation of private interests from government policies went even further. The struggle of the interwar period was not simply a clash between French interests on the one side and German interests on the other. During the development of the Ruhr-Lorraine industrial complex, like-minded industrialists in France and Germany had become directors of jointly owned and jointly controlled financial, industrial, and distributing enterprises. In many cases, common views on questions of economic organization, labor policy, social legislation, and attitude toward government had been far more important to the industrialists than differences of nationality or citizenship. After 1870, the interdependence of the French and German iron and steel industries led the owners to work together, despite national differences, although the private activities of the French owners were in many instances in direct opposition to French public policy. It is curious to note that only the French appeared to have this conflict between public policy and private activities. On the German side, complete coordination seems to have been preserved between national and private interests, between officials of the German Republic and the leaders of German industry and finance. During World War I, the de Vendels, the influential French-German banking and industrial family, which headed the French wing of the international steel cartel through their Comité des Forges, and whose members had sat in the parliaments of both France and Germany, were able to keep the French army from destroying industrial plants belonging to the German enterprises of the Ruschling family. These plants were located in the Brie Basin, a Lorraine ore field, then in German control. The Ruschling family, with their powerful complex of coal, iron, steel, and banking enterprises in Germany, has for generations played in close harmony with the de Vendel family. For a century, the descendants of Christian Ruschling have dominated the industry and commerce of the Saar Basin. It was Hermann Ruschling who arranged the return of the Saar to Germany in the plebiscite of January 1935 by organizing the Deutsche Front, which delivered 90% of the votes to the Nazis. Though 72 members of the Ruschling family have survived 2 world wars and are still active in the business of the Saar today, 2 other members of the family, Hermann and his brother Robert, deserve a special place in history. During World War I, Hermann, a cavalry captain in the German army, and Robert, a major, had been put in charge of production in the Brie Basin. After the war, when the brothers Ruschling moved out of the areas which had to be ceded to France under the treaty, the 2 of them carried away bodily a couple of large steel plants. Conceiving this grand larceny to be something in the nature of a war crime, the French government tried the brothers Ruschling in absentia and sentenced them to 40 years in prison. But the German government never would give up the Ruschlings to the French. For the next 22 years, the brothers were under this cloud as far as the French government was concerned. On the other hand, as far as the French Steelmakers Association, the Comité de Forges, and in particular the de Vendels who headed the comité were concerned, business as usual, or in this case business as unusual, prevailed. In the end, even the French government weakened for business purposes, though the war crime sentence remained. When it came time for France to build its impregnable Maginot Line, who should be called in to supply steel and technical assistance but the German firm of the brothers Rushling? If the French behaved in this case as did the Americans during World War II in the case of insurance coverages on war plants, they doubtless placed plenty of guards to protect the security and secrecy of the Maginot Line construction from the prying eyes of the general public, while the blueprints rested safely in the hands of the only people to whom they mattered, to wit, the enemy. Now comes the outbreak of World War II. The French army marching into the Saar during the phony war period in 1939 received orders not to fire on or damage the plants of the war criminals, the brothers Rushling. In 1940 came the Blitz and the fall of France. The Vichy government passed a decree exonerating the Rushlings and canceling their 40-year prison sentences. In 1945 came the Blitz in the other direction. As we were starting out to round up the key industrialists, the Rushlings fell once more into the hands of the French, but this time it was the French army, acting in its role of representative of French public policy. Again, the order of the day was the Rushlings, war criminals. In 1947, Hermann Rushling was tried by an international court in the French zone and convicted of waging aggressive war. He was sentenced to 7 years' imprisonment. Robert had died before he could get his criminal record in order. But since there are still 72 Rushlings to go, it is not yet possible to write the final chapter to their history. In 1945, in contrast with the close working arrangements kept through at least 2 wars by the Germans and the French iron and steel groups, the French public policy seemed still to have a healthy dislike for any setup that would leave German industry dominant in Western Europe. French officers like René Sargent, who became head of economic and financial affairs for the French group in the Control Council at Berlin, seemed to distrust the intentions of Germany's industrial leadership. The Germans, according to Sargent, had established quite a record for insisting upon and carrying out measures to prevent the Allied powers from rendering Germany harmless. Of course, no one should expect a German political or business leader to want to be harmless. Most Germans who meant anything in German industry or politics after World War I considered it an act of patriotism to evade the terms of the Versailles Treaty. In fact, in the years after Versailles, the German courts would entertain prosecutions for the crime of high treason against any German citizen who concerned himself with the execution of the treaty in such a way that a foreign power was advised of infractions. Clearly, the Germans themselves would expect to be supervised and watched. It would be a point of honor, as well as self-interest, to defy detection and to camouflage or conceal their intentions. From our discoveries during 3 years with the economic warfare section, we had already narrowed down a list of Germans who carried the major responsibility for what had happened. The list was impressively small, for somewhere among a group of not more than 100 men were those who had done the lion's share of the planning and had carried out the worldwide negotiations that made the economic preparations for war a success. Still, even a list of 100 important individuals controlling 60 or 70 of the biggest companies was too large for pinpoint investigation by our small crew. Were there some 5 or 10 or 12 men among these who stood head and shoulders above the others, either in knowledge or in degree of responsibility for the German efforts? Perhaps the records of the international steel cartel at Luxembourg would furnish clues to help us concentrate our attention first on a few individuals and a few companies in Germany. But Luxembourg was liberated territory. One could not simply walk in and open up filing cases and take a look. In March 1945, Luxembourg as yet had no government of its own. The Grand Duchy was under the protection of an Allied military mission headed by an American, Colonel Frank E. Fraser. To get permission even to negotiate with the Luxembourgers for a look into the records, we had to show how the inquiry would contribute toward investigation in Germany itself, which fell within the mandate of General Eisenhower's cable to the Combined Chiefs of Staff, SCAF 239. It was a hen and egg paradox. To get what we needed from the Luxembourg records, we had to know what we were going to find out in the Ruhr. The Ruhr at the moment was bulging with Wehrmacht units. Chapter 4. The Fraternity Brothers. On April 14, 1945, the Grand Duchess Charlotte returned to resume her constitutional sway over the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. This little Graustark, or Ruritania, with 1,000 square miles of territory and 300,000 inhabitants, squeezed in between Germany on one side and France and Belgium on the other, is a maze of contrasts from almost any standpoint. Its official language sounds like Flemish, with a dash of French, and looks like German. People on the street thank you with a mixed French-German merci vielen Dank or merci vielen mal, but most of the people who speak this mixed language are more violently anti-German than their French neighbors to the west. In contrast with the unproductive German terrain immediately to the east, which looks exactly the same so far as soil and contours are concerned, most of Luxembourg, and especially the northern half, might be called fiercely agricultural, with very high productivity, even though the northern half of the Grand Duchy was overrun and most of its farmhouses destroyed during the Battle of the Bulge. While the German territory to the east was practically untouched, Luxembourg's agriculture bounced back immediately after the Second Liberation, early in 1945. Within 2 years, Luxembourg was 90% self-sufficient in food. The Germans across the line, after 2 years, were still pleading for food to stave off starvation. The Industrial Revolution had come to Luxembourg with the discovery of domestic deposits of minette ore in 1870. This was the same year in which Bismarck's armies snatched the minette ore fields and other resources of Alsace-Lorraine from France on behalf of the growing Reich. But for many years, Luxembourg's industry kept its independence from German control. The largest steel firm, the Aciéries Réunies de Bourbach-Eick-Dudelang, known as Arbed, even reached into German territory. Just before World War I, Arbed got control of enough coal mining properties in Germany near Eschweiler in the Aachen Basin to ensure a full supply of coking coal to the Luxembourg mills. Arbed next established the largest steel cable works in Europe, the Felten and Guillaume Karlswerk at Cologne on the Rhine. Between the two wars, however, this independence had become obscured while Luxembourg played host to the steel cartel. A week before the Grand Duchess returned, a small group of our men from SHAEF headquarters finally got permission to enter Luxembourg and negotiate a trip through the files of the International Steel Cartel. Though they wanted to look for the particulars of German control and to identify the Germans who had been pulling the strings since the cartel was organized in 1926, our men had to proceed carefully, because nothing could be done without the voluntary permission of the cartel's officers. Quite by accident, our team arrived on a Saturday, and simultaneously with a visit by General Eisenhower. The officials of the steel cartel somehow gained the impression that General Eisenhower's visit had been made especially to lend additional high-level sanction to the visit of the Department of Justice officials attached to SHAEF. Hector Dieudonné, secretary of the cartel, and the other top cartel officials who were heading for the country over the weekend, told Eric Conrote, the office manager, to give every assistance to the gentleman from Schaeff. Mr. Conrote unexpectedly took the instructions quite literally. He opened up all the filing cabinets in the office of the cartel and invited the gentlemen from Schaeff to make themselves at home for the entire weekend. They did. It is not hard to imagine the hair pulling among the top officials when they returned Monday morning. They found an extremely weary and sleepless investigative crew sitting among a mass of folders from which an index had been compiled of close to 4,000 documents. The investigators expressed their gratitude and said they would very much like permission to make photostats of the 4,000 documents. With a great deal of grinding of teeth and scarcely restrained mutterings at Mr. Conrote's misunderstanding of diplomatic language, they finally gave their consent, but not without making a protest that their hospitality had in some way been abused by what amounted to police methods. The 4,000 documents had opened up a panorama of international ties among all the major steel firms of the world, including the details of their working relations with the Germans from the time the cartel was organized. While the crowds were milling about in front of the royal palace, in a tremendous demonstration over the return of the Grand Duchess, Mr. Alois Meyer, managing director of the Arbed Steel Combine, returned quietly to the city of Luxembourg from Germany. He had left when the Germans left, but came back with the explanation that he had been kidnapped. Mr. Meyer for years had been more than the managing director of a large steel enterprise. Ever since 1928, he had been permanent chairman of the International Steel Cartel, and during the German occupation he had been appointed by his longtime German business associate, Ernst Ponsgen, to be the leader of the Steel Industry Wirtschaftsgruppe in Luxembourg. Ponsgen, principal figure in the United Steel Works of Germany, had played the leading role in establishing the International Steel Cartel in 1926. During World War II, Ponsgen was appointed to head the Steel Industry Association, one of the main divisions of the Nazi Reichsgruppe industry, an officially sanctioned national association of manufacturers. It was not surprising that he chose his Luxembourg associate Mr. Meyer to handle the affairs of the Wirtschaftsgruppe in occupied Luxembourg. Upon the occupation of Luxembourg by the Germans in 1940, the Arbed firm had not been taken over directly by the Germans, but continued to function under the direction of Alois Meyer throughout the occupation. The other two Luxembourg steel companies, Hodder and Rodange, were taken over by the Germans when the managers refused to collaborate. After the liberation of Luxembourg, 19 men who were department chiefs, production men, and engineers of Arbed were dismissed for collaboration, while Meyer remained as head of the firm. The official attitude was that Meyer had become a hero by keeping his firm intact during the war, and thereby preventing the removal of Luxembourg workers from the local steel plants to Germany for work in the German plants. Some officials even alleged that the Arbed management had arranged to slow down production and thereby sabotage the German war effort. But the comparative figures for Arbed and the other two Luxembourg firms did not bear this out. Actually, limits by the Germans on coal exports accounted for the same reduced production rate in all the Luxembourg mills. What the Luxembourgers chose to do with Alois Meyer did not change what was on the papers in the files of the steel cartel. It was not necessary to wait for photostats of all the thousands of documents to realize that we now had an enlarged picture from which to work. Here was something that had gone beyond mere German resistance to the occupation measures of the Allied powers after World War I. It was a concrete example of how leading German manufacturers had gone about the job of recapturing control over industries and markets and making Germany the industrial hub of Europe. This was not resistance, but a counterattack that included enlisting the help of industrialists in other countries. Here again, the step-by-step history threw some light on what had happened, but at the same time raised questions about why the others let the Germans get what they wanted. The mid-20s were remarkable for German industrial combination. They marked the formation of the United Steel Works in Germany as a combination of the four biggest steel producers: Ernst Ponsgen, Fritz Thyssen, Otto Wolff, and the others who drew this combine together had managed to get over $100 million from private investors in the United States. Dillon Reed and Company, the New York investment house, which brought Clarence Dillon, James V. Forrestal, William H. Draper, Jr., and others into prominence, floated the United Steel Works bonds in the United States behind a glowing prospectus which declared that the United Steel Works Corporation, Vereinigte Stahlwerk, will be the largest industrial unit in Europe and one of the largest manufacturers of iron and steel in the world, ranking in productive capacity second only to United States Steel Corporation. The formation of United Steel gave its management tremendous power in Germany, enough to carry through without delay the organization of the German domestic steel cartel, and to guarantee the good behavior of all German steel companies in their agreements with foreign firms. In 1925, the IG Farben chemical combine was formed by 6 of the biggest German chemical producers, and the next year the International Steel Cartel was created through a private international treaty or working arrangement among the principal steel producers of the world. The events were not unrelated. All of these organizations had a number of directors in common and were part of a privately managed rationalization scheme for controlling the basic industries of Europe and regulating the international trade in the products of the basic heavy industries. In the case of steel, the motives of the German groups were clear. Cut off by political boundaries from organizing a German-controlled steel industry based on the most efficient use of resources, the German managers who formed the new combines aimed to improve their commercial position by establishing control over the market. If they could not have economy in production, they could still run a profitable business, provided they could control domestic and international marketing conditions by agreement. They could not afford to let possible competitors in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Britain, or the United States start a struggle for markets. These others would have advantages based on more efficient production or distribution facilities, especially while the Germans were setting up their plants designed to use ores from faraway points overseas. The loans which the bigger operators got from Britain and the United States to put them on their feet after the inflation also enabled them to pay prices far above the market values to buy out troublesome competing firms. In effect, the foreign loans and German government subsidies allowed the leading companies, such as United Steel Works, Mannesmann, Krupp, Good Hope, and Röchling, to substitute private regulations and elimination of competition for the technical efficiency they had lost when their plants in Alsace and Lorraine went back to French control after 1918. After combinations like United Steel and IG Farben had pulled together under common control a great proportion of the existing capacity, they built still more plants and added more machinery, but the amount of goods manufactured did not grow in anything like the same proportion. At the height of the boom, in 1928, the whole German steel industry was running at only a little over 2/3 of its capacity. In other fields of heavy industry, actual production was as low as 10% of the installed capacity. In the construction of locomotives, a field monopolized by the Borsig and Henschel combines, output at the height of the boom was only 5% of capacity. Later, in World War II, when Henschel specialized in Tiger tanks and 88mm guns, the formerly idle capacity came into its own. Unfortunately, the bondholders who put up the money for these increases in heavy industrial capacity never got the benefit of the supposed strength and soundness of the companies. The The low output in relation to the large capacity meant a huge unpaid debt to foreign investors who had bought the bonds. The companies were technically bankrupt until saved by government subsidies. But the subsidies were arranged only after payments to foreigners had been forbidden by foreign exchange regulations. After piling up a record like that, a private citizen might have trouble getting money even from a loan shark. From a long-run standpoint, the records indicated that the organization of the German iron and steel industry was wasteful. A commission, known as the Enquete-Ausschuss, had been appointed by the German government early in the 1930s to investigate conditions that had led to the Industrial Depression. The commission had found that the steel industry was clumsily put together and was overexpanded in proportion to Germany's light industry and consumer goods production. By fixing their sights on control of domestic and international markets, instead of meeting the economic needs of German industry for iron and steel, the German steel industry had put itself into a position where control must be maintained over international markets, or the industry must go bankrupt. But German steel products could be distributed in international trade only so long as no foreign competitors undercut Germany by competitive selling. The Nazi economic ministry later gave due recognition to Dr. Ponsgen for his services to the German iron and steel industry through his organization of the national and international steel cartels. October 17, 1941, Ponsgen's 70th birthday was celebrated in the Stahlhof at Düsseldorf as Ernst Ponsgen's Great Day, as the Deutsche Bergwerks Zeitung reported. So many leading personalities of business and industry had seldom been seen together. The Nazi economic minister, Walter Funk, was personally present to award Ponsgen the Eagle Shield of the Reich, which put him, as Funk said, into a class with men like Robert Bosch, Karl Duisberg, Emil Kerdorf, Albert Pietsch, and Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach. Funk paid tribute to Ponsgen's contribution in organizing the cartels, which he said will have great importance in the reconstruction of Europe after this war. Concluding, Funk said, "The Führer has ordered me to present to you the Eagle Shield as a special tribute to an economic leader who has performed extraordinary services in arming Germany." When the first international agreement was signed on September 30, 1926, between leading iron and steel producers of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Saar, and Germany, all the sponsors of the cartel had joined in declaring that it was a first step in the formation of an economic United States of Europe. Dr. Ponsgen and his helpers, however, had more immediate interests. They had contrived the original terms of the organization so as to play upon two strong motives: fear of German competition, even though the German mills would have been able to compete only through money borrowed in the United States and Britain, and the desire of the leading firms in each country to enlist the power of German industry as an ally in crushing their own domestic competition. Membership in the cartel was not open to individual companies, but only to the national associations to which they belonged. These associations bound themselves to limit their entire national steel production and the total volume of sales in domestic and international markets. Domestic sales were controlled by all parties agreeing not to undersell in each other's countries, so leaving the member companies only the non-member companies within their own boundaries as competition, to be eliminated by drastic short-term price cutting or by purchase. The international markets seemed secure because although the charter members in 1926 accounted for only 30% of the world's ingot steel production, they accounted for nearly two-thirds of the world's exports. All members agreed that in foreign markets they would not undersell each other, but would undersell any non-member in order to drive him out of the market. In order to get the cartel started, the German group at first accepted a production quota for themselves, which they considered very low in proportion to their actual steel capacity. The German quota for the first year was a little over 40% of the total for all 5 groups. The cartel had been in existence only a few months, however, when Paul Roche, chairman of the German National Group and also a director of the Good Hope Steel Works, said that Germany would try to get an increase in its quota, and that the original low quota had been a concession to get the agreement established. Under the cartel agreement, excess production and sales by any national group beyond the established quota was subject to a penalty at various rates up to $4 a ton. Any fines paid by members for producing and selling too much were to be used as a fund out of which to recompense cartel members who produced and sold less than their allowable quotas. This provision seems to have lulled most of the members into a comfortable and careful state. Most of them stayed well within their quotas. But not so the Germans. In the first year of the cartel's existence, the Germans paid fines amounting to $10,038,000, covering excess production of 3,372,000 tons. This excess tonnage alone was almost equal to the entire annual output of the Belgians. The fines paid by the Germans accounted for 95% of the total penalties incurred by all the original cartel members during the first year. The advantage to the Germans showed up in later years. With their greatly expanded capacity, they next threatened to disrupt the organization, unless the quota scheme was revised to give them a higher quota. Before the first year was out, the Germans, in addition to a higher quota, got an agreement that 72% of their quota should be regarded as production for German domestic consumption, on which the penalty for excess production was to be only half that established in the 1926 agreement. In September 1927, the penalty on excess production for domestic consumption was again cut in half. The full penalty was to be paid only on the 28% of German output which was to be regarded as production for export. In the second year of the cartel, 1927, German steel productions of 16,311,000 tons was nearly 4 million greater than in 1926. France, in the same year, decreased production by 54,000 tons, down to a total of 8,403,000 for the year. From this point on, Dr. Ponsgen's extraordinary services in arming Germany continued with the same kind of success. Alternating threats and concessions consistently increased the ability of the German group to control quotas and limit the production of the non-German members almost at will. Small wonder that when the International Steel Cartel was first set up in September 1926, just 3 weeks after Germany had joined the League of Nations, a member of the Reichstag, Dr. Reicher, declared that by means of this agreement, important consequences of the Versailles Treaty can be mitigated. As we wound up our work in the files of the steel cartel, we could see that this arrangement had gone very far indeed in mitigating the consequences of the Versailles Treaty. By 1938, about 90% of all iron and steel shipped in international trade was under the control of the International Steel Cartel. The membership by that time had been expanded to include the major steel producers in Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, but the Germans were still running the show. What could one of the non-German groups hope to get out of membership in the cartel? The American firms went to some legal risk in order to join. Among the documents we photostated at Luxembourg were memoranda of agreements in which it was said that the American concerns were unable to sign the formal agreements for division of territories and restriction of markets because of the antitrust laws, but that a verbal agreement to the same effect had been secured. The records showed that as the activities of the International Steel Cartel expanded, it had become obvious to the Europeans that without the cooperation of American steel companies, they could not hope to maintain their control over international markets. The tremendous productive power of the American steel industry was the problem. If American producers were free to sell steel products in international trade at competitive prices, instead of complying with the fixed prices and limited marketing areas worked out by the cartel members, then every time the others got the world price up to a comfortable and profitable level, the American outsiders could undercut and cash in. The European group did not really need to worry, however. The three biggest American producers, United States Steel, Bethlehem, and Republic, had their own reasons for wanting to join. From their standpoint, the cooperation of the European producers in blocking or policing the activities of American independence would help maintain and increase the Big Three's control over the American domestic market. The independents, wherever they tried to do business in the rest of the world, would find themselves hemmed in by the one-for-all and all-for-one spirit of the cartel members, and by the difficulties they would encounter in the form of foreign government regulations and red tape. A little of this experience might make the independents more amenable to reason where the organized firms were concerned, and this would be reflected even in their behavior at home. But first, the Big Three had to catch their rabbit. The clause in the international agreement which presented the greatest stumbling block to the American group was Article 4 of the Export Agreement, which read as follows: "The contracting parties accept the responsibility for the engagements undertaken under the agreement, both for themselves and for outsiders in their respective countries, for the present as well as for the future. They shall be debited with these outsiders' exports and shall be responsible for the payment of penalties. In respect of excesses, both contracting parties shall establish a list of the present outsiders in their territories and shall report as soon as possible about the appearance of new outsiders on their markets." Up to the end of March 1938, only 58% of the American exports in the heavy steel group were made by members of the Steel Export Association. Since 42% of the exports were made by outsiders, the members of the Steel Export Association had refused to accept responsibility for keeping all American exports within the quota allowed by the cartel to the United States. By June of 1938, however, the position of the American insiders had progressed to the point where they felt it would be possible to give partial guarantees of the good behavior of the American outsiders. At a meeting held in Paris on June 14, 1938, an agreement was reached between the Joint Coordinating Committee of the International Steel Cartel and a delegation from the Steel Export Association of America, representing United States Steel, Bethlehem, and Republic. At this meeting, the Big Three accepted unconditionally the terms of the 1937 agreement, which had brought the British Iron and Steel Federation into the cartel. The Steel Export Association of America agreed, on behalf of United States Steel, Bethlehem, and Republic, not only that these three firms would abide by the quota agreements of the cartel, but also that they would accept responsibility as part of their own quota for some exports by American outsiders. The Big Three would charge against their quota any shipments by independent American firms, up to an amount not exceeding 10% of the quota. If the outsiders' shipments amounted to more than 10%, but not over 20% of the American quota, the Big Three agreed to charge half of the excess against their own quota. But the Big Three did not feel able to assume the penalties for outsider shipments beyond 20% of the American quota. As in all things, even insiders have to accept slow but steady progress as the means of getting what they're after. Negotiations on behalf of the American group in 1938 were conducted principally by Benjamin F. Fairless, President of United States Steel, Eugene G. Grace, President of Bethlehem Steel, and Tom Girdler, Chairman of the Board of Republic Steel. The American group undertook to try to bring 10 additional, smaller American producers into the agreement by having them join the Steel Export Association. They arranged to have 2 representatives of the Steel Export Association remain in Europe to continue the relations between the Steel Export Association and the International Steel Cartel. These were Messrs. J. O. Outwater, president of the Steel Export Association, and William B. Todd, who were to work together with the British group through Mr. Ian F. L. Elliott, representative of Sir Andrew Duncan's British Iron and Steel Federation. Mr. Elliott was to turn up several years later as a representative of the United States on the International Control Authority for the German Ruhr. But at the time his was just one name among many. More important to us at the moment was the tie-in between Luxembourg and Germany. Despite appearances, Luxembourg, with its 13th century stone parapets and parrot cage sentry boxes, and its hero, Alois Meyer, could scarcely be dismissed as comic opera material. According to the cartel agreement, the chairmanship of the managing committee was supposed to rotate annually among the participating countries. Actually, the headquarters remained permanently fixed in offices belonging to the Arbed Steel Combine in Luxembourg. When the first chairman of the cartel was killed in an accident in 1928, he was succeeded by Meyer, who continued as chairman of the cartel until its activities were interrupted by World War II. For years, Alois Meyer, as head of Arbed, had been a director of Arbed's subsidiary in Germany, the large Felten and Guillaume cable works. Working with Mr. Meyer and serving as chairman of the board of directors of Felten and Guillaume was Baron Kurt von Schroeder, Hitler's banker. As far as we were concerned, the line from Mr. Meyer and Arbed and the International Steel Cartel to von Schroeder's private bank at Cologne could have been as thin as a filament of spider's web. We were looking for the spider. Chapter 5. Hare and Hounds. Going into Germany from France and Luxembourg was like entering a tunnel. The friendly flag-waving of children and grown-ups that enlivened the dusty, jolting ride through towns and countryside in the liberated territories gave way abruptly to a black, empty feeling of being alone, moving toward one distant objective. That is how we felt as we approached the German city of Bonn, the afternoon of April 16, 1945. Nearly a month before, the T-Force party at Cologne had reported bad luck at the bank of the cartel kings, Baron Kurt von Schroeder's bank. The building at number 1 Laurenzplatz, near the cathedral, was a wreck. The vaults and records were under 20 feet of rubble and twisted steel. However, the steel cartel files at Luxembourg had given us the location of Baron von Schroeder's villa at Bonn, 15 miles south of Cologne, and we decided to try there. Nobody was living in the battle-damaged villa when we dropped in that April evening. In a damp cellar room, we found a stack of papers, some baled and some loose. The pile was about 4 feet high and 10 in diameter. On top of one bale, under a stack of letterheads, was a folder of letters addressed to Baron von Schroeder, some in his capacity as a leader of the Nazi Party, and some in his capacity as a lieutenant general in the SS Black Guards. Quite a few of the letters were on elegant stationery with a letterhead that needed no address or telephone number. A chastely engraved Reichsführer SS was enough. The scrawled signature, H. Himmler, was simply an added flourish. The files and account books, all bearing the mark of the bank house J. H. Stein, founded 1790, of Cologne, appeared to be a few tons out of the many that had comprised the working files of the bank. Their position near the furnace in our host's house did not necessarily mean that he considered them trash. We found very often in Germany that the speed of the advance had been consistently underestimated by Germans of all ranks. Nothing else would explain their common failure to carry through simple precautions like burning papers or blowing up bridges. The letters from Heinrich Himmler to Baron Kurt von Schroeder were interesting but monotonous. The man seemed always to be asking for money, nor was he interested in small change. The amounts were nice round figures running into the hundreds of thousands and often millions of Reichsmarks. The Schroeder family of Hamburg, into which Baron Kurt von Schroeder was born in November 1889, had been bankers for generations. In a preceding generation, Baron Johann Heinrich von Schroeder had moved to London, adopted the anglicized name J. Henry Schroeder, and developed an extensive business financing overseas trade, especially with Latin America. Another member of the family, Baron Bruno von Schroeder, Kurt's cousin, born in Hamburg in 1867, moved to London early in life, but retained his German citizenship until 1914, when he became a British subject. Baron Bruno headed the banking firms J. Henry Schroeder and Company of London and the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation of New York until his death in 1940, when he was succeeded by his son, Helmut W.B. Schroeder, the present head. There appeared to be no community of ownership between the Stein Bank of Cologne and the Schroeder Banks of London and New York, though the two groups acted as correspondent banks for one another and participated jointly in so many deals that what the Germans call an Interessengemeinschaft, or community of interests, existed between them. The pattern for this parallel action had been laid in 1914, when the British closed down German banks in London, but allowed the Schroeder firm, headed by British subjects, to operate through the war. The list of major clients of the bank house J.H. Stein was a roster of West German heavy industry. The records left no doubt that the Stein Bank had been in a good position to help the London firm to live up to its reputation as the bridge between London's city and the industry of the Rhineland and Ruhr. Among the number of threads that had made us decide to pay a call on Baron Kurt von Schroeder and his bank had been an argument back in England, at Bushy Park, when we were planning our itinerary. I've already mentioned that for a time we were assigned to work in the finance division of General Wickersham's headquarters with Captain Norbert A. Bogdan, vice president of the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation of New York. Captain Bogdan had argued vigorously against investigation of the Stein Bank on the ground that it was small potatoes. We should concentrate our efforts on bigger targets, such as the Deutsche Bank and the Commerzbank. To waste time on small-scale private banks would discredit our investigations. We had noted, however, that the day after this outburst, two of the permanent members of Captain Bogdan's staff requested military travel orders to Cologne to investigate the Stein Bank. This was an unusual application. Since Cologne had not yet fallen, it was tantamount to a request to accompany the T forces immediately behind the combat units. The intelligence division blocked that one. Another thread had been the business collaboration of many years' standing between Baron Kurt von Schroeder and a very good friend of Franz von Papen, Gerhard A. Westrick. Dr. Westrick was a prominent German lawyer and a member of the law partnership of Albert and Westrick. The senior partner of that firm, Dr. Heinrich Albert, was another of von Papen's friends. Albert had come to the United States in 1914, supposedly as a German commercial attaché, and had raised something over $30 million from American sources friendly to Germany to finance the espionage and sabotage activities which Franz von Papen directed in the United States during World War I. With these funds, for example, the heavy chemical industry of the United States was crippled by the simple expedient of buying up all of the chemical stoneware produced in the United States. Stoneware was at that time the only type of equipment that could resist the corrosive action of the important heavy chemicals. Many American chemical plants were eventually shut down for lack of this stoneware. For the duration of World War I, it kept piling up in warehouses leased by von Papen's cloaks. After World War I, the law firm of Albert and Westrick was very busy with the program of American loans to build up Germany, beginning in October 1924, when American investors advanced $110 million of the original $200 million international loan. Under the Dawes Plan, a stream of private loans to German governmental organizations, public utilities, banks, and industries had poured in American money from private sources at the average rate of over $250 million a year, until the American crash of 1929. Two American investment banking organizations handled the bulk of this private lending system for the rebuilding of Germany. They were Dillon Reed and Company of New York and the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation. Legal work on the Schroeder Bank loans was always handled in Germany by the firm of Albert and Westrick, and in the United States by Sullivan and Cromwell, the firm headed by John Foster Dulles. But to return to Gerhard Westrick, in April 1940, this fraternity brother had come to the United States, ostensibly as a commercial counselor to the German embassy, but actually on a direct assignment as personal representative of the Nazi foreign minister, von Ribbentrop. His mission was to attempt to convince American business leaders that they would gain by a Hitler victory, and to persuade them to help in keeping the United States out of the war. Dr. Westrick rented a house in Westchester County, New York, where his visitors included many nationally prominent executives of certain American oil and other industrial corporations. After it began to appear that Dr. Westrick's efforts had gone beyond the normal activities of a diplomatic representative, the Department of Justice required him to register as a German propaganda agent. Then the New York Herald Tribune and other papers assigned reporters and photographers to dog his tail and highlight everything he did. On October 9, 1940, he sailed for Japan. The American press congratulated itself on having made Westrick's propaganda mission an ignominious failure. But as we looked into the transactions of Baron von Schroeder and Dr. Westrick, we wondered. There were many questions we would have liked to ask Baron von Schroeder had he been home that April evening in 1945. But it was not until 2 months later that another of our men, Robert West, formerly of the White House detail of the Secret Service, tracked him down. Von Schroeder was found in a detention camp for SS prisoners in France, masquerading in the battle-fatigue dress of an SS corporal. Some of the records began to make sense, even without Baron von Schroeder. Several bundles were the detailed ledgers of deposits into the special account labeled Sonderkonto S. What struck us first was the all-star cast which made up this list of depositors. Of the 40 or 50 names which turned up regularly in the pages, running all the way back to 1933, we recognized about 20 immediately as well-known directors of the biggest German industrial firms in the fields of coal, iron and steel, machinery, chemicals, electrical equipment, transport, and electrical power. In the galaxy of corporations dealing with the Stein Bank, this list of individuals might not have seemed unusual except for two things: the regularity of the deposits in this joint account and the close relation between decreases in the account and the Himmler letters asking for money. This one account, we learned by putting little pieces of evidence together, covered only the running expenses of Himmler's SS, and perhaps some of the Gestapo. But if one special account had the letter S, it was a fair guess that somewhere in the Stein Bank or elsewhere there could be other special accounts, A or B or Y or Z. The arrangement was simplicity itself. At a wink or a nod from someone, in this case we later found it was Wilhelm Kepler, of the Nazis' Hermann Göring steel combine, the contributors would quietly make deposits into the special account at the bank. When the leader of the party formation, in this case Himmler, wanted money, he asked for it, and it was drawn against the same account. No muss, no fuss, no Nazi connections for the contributors. The next day, after the discovery of von Schroeder's records, we divided our party. Besides Bursler, Sachs, and myself, there were René Manès, a naval lieutenant from Schaef, and an expert accountant, Bernard Glaser from the Treasury, John Walker, specialist in German documents, and Richard Thompson, FBI liaison with 12th Army Group. René Manès and I left the rest of the party at von Schroeder's villa and went down to Cologne to look for records of the steel interests belonging to Otto Wolff, a leading contributor to the S account. Wolff himself had died in 1940, but the files of his firm were intact in 3 sub-basements of a building not far from the wreckage of the Steinbank. We put a guard on the records, arranged billeting for some of the party, and returned to Bonn. All told, we collected several tons of documents from Bonn and Cologne, most of which we sent back to Versailles with Manès. Bursler, Sachs, and I packed ourselves and nearly a ton of records into an open weapons carrier and banged along eastward to Frankfurt am Main. We hoped to find some of the living contributors to Sonderkonto S and dig further into the reasons why they considered it good business to make these donations. In particular, I wanted to interview Baron von Schnitzler again in his villa near Frankfurt. 2 weeks before, von Schnitzler had looked every inch a baron. From his black Homburg, velvet collar, and gray spats, to the young and beautiful Baroness on his arm, one would never have guessed that von Schnitzler was a criminal, one of the financial mainstays of the Nazi regime, and a mastermind of the IG Farben foreign organization. When Frankfurt fell on the 27th and 28th of March, 1945, von Schnitzler was living comfortable and unperturbed in his villa not many miles outside the city. His manner was that of the master of the house greeting the fire department. He was affable, urbane, but kept the firemen in their place. He offered brandy and then withdrew it in deference to the non-fraternization order. His manner managed to imply that the non-fraternization idea was an immature gesture, typical of a certain kind of American. The war had not touched Baron von Schnitzler, and to hear him tell it, he had not touched the war. It was a case of live and let live. He asked us how soon he would be able to get in touch with his friends in Imperial Chemical Industries Limited in England and DuPont in the United States. He said he was relieved that the recent unpleasantness was over. It was very important that he and his friends should pick up where they had left off and build for the future. Now that we had the records of his deposits into Sonderkonto S, I wanted to get him back for a longer talk. When we had him brought to our field office in the Reichsbank building at Frankfurt for questioning, Baron von Schnitzler denied having had anything to do with Hitler or the Nazi Party. They were beneath him. He was a businessman, and his factories had produced things which the Nazis needed, but they had come to him. Certainly, he had never contributed in any way to their activities. He had deliberately avoided knowing anything at all about government business done by the firm. That was handled by other directors. Baron von Schnitzler was thoroughly at ease throughout the several hours of our questioning. We warned him repeatedly of the stiff penalties for making false statements, but he talked on persuasively and smoothly, in perfect English. The records of Sonderkonto S seemed miles and ages away as the Baron talked. Perhaps he did not know the records had been found, and he was bluffing or lying, but actually in his own mind he need not have seen any inconsistency between his pose as an unpolitical businessman who did not want to know about government business, poison gas, slave labor, Auschwitz, and all that, and his record of steady contributions of at least $40,000 a year to Sonderkonto S. In his own way, he was speaking of a world in which one makes the necessary contributions to causes without feeling personally involved at all. That is not to say that the Baron was unaware of how his behavior might be interpreted by those of us who did not belong to his fraternity. All through our conversations, both at his villa and in the Reichsbank building, the interrogators had been anonymous. The German intelligence service had had most American government officials bracketed in preparation for the occupation. But they needed to know who was coming in order to know what records to hide first. We never addressed one another by name or gave any hint of the reason for our interest in the Baron's business. To put him at ease, I pretended at the first interview that I had never heard of the I.G. Farben firm, nor of von Schnitzler. At the outset, I asked him what he did for a living. When he said he was a director of I.G. Farben Industry, I asked him what that was. He said it was a company. What did the company do? Make shoes, ships, textiles? It was a chemical firm, he stated, a very large chemical firm. As the questions rolled along, all of a police blotter variety, implying a profound ignorance on our part, von Schnitzler sat back with a bland and contented look, arching his eyebrows and leveling a hawk-like gaze along his Roman nose, as though it were the barrel of a fowling piece. He lied like a trooper through it all. Toward the end of the second interview, however, von Schnitzler tried to find out who we were, and one of our men made the mistake of calling me by name. For just one instant, the Baron's eyes registered a quick appraisal. He then carefully and deliberately recrossed his legs, shifted his gloves from one hand to the other, and asked if I was satisfied that all his replies had been truthful and complete. When I told him merely that if we wanted anything further he would hear from us, he persisted for several minutes, asking in various ways if we did not want him to clarify any of his answers. Later, we found in his files copies of published testimony on I.G. Farben that several of us had presented to a Senate committee in 1944, with our names underlined in green ink. Von Schnitzler did not appear particularly surprised when at the end of the interview he was taken to jail, charged with making false statements to military government officers, and later held for trial as an industrial war criminal. He was among those convicted in 1948 and sentenced to 12 years for profiting from the war and for being responsible for abuse of foreign workers. He and all the other industrialists tried with him were acquitted, however, of complicity in starting the war, because the court held that they had not had advance knowledge of Hitler's specific plans for military aggression. These men had started a chain of events whose inevitable outcome was war, but in the eyes of the law, as the American judges construed it, only those who had forged the last link could be guilty of a crime. The old Frankfurt had been almost leveled to the ground, while the I.G. Farben office building, one of the largest in the world, stood untouched. The handsome cathedral where kings of the Holy Roman Empire had been crowned, the little inns with their carvings and paintings, and the hundreds of other weathered and mellowed reminders of Germany's old life in the times before Bismarck, Hohenzollern, and Hitler, all had suffered the tortures of the damned. But the Nazi edifice of the New Order, literally a giant filing cabinet loaded with hundreds of tons of paper and records of the Farben Empire, remained whole. In the synthetic Nazi economy, Farben's mountains of paper were fully as important as the mountains of coal in the Ruhr. The German businessmen who had handled Farben's gentlemanly agreements with the fraternity brothers in other countries were prolific writers of memoranda. They had kept voluminous diaries and notes of conferences. Patents and patent licensing agreements, domestic and international, were the stuff their dreams were made on. The very volume of their paperwork was almost our undoing. The main Farben building consisted of 6 large wings, each 7 stories high, arranged to form an arc of a circle and connected by 5 hyphens of the same height. This colossus of steel and buff-colored stone was bulging with everything from contracts with DuPont and Imperial Chemical for the division of world markets, down to the invoices of shipments of drugs or photographic film to a little wholesaler in Buenos Aires. In all the fighting for the city, hardly a window had been cracked, and not a filing cabinet disturbed. But as the city fell, into this refuge had swarmed over 11,000 displaced persons and liberated slave laborers looking for temporary shelter and warmth. Within 2 days, the rooms, corridors, and stairwells of the building had become snowbound in a blizzard of papers. Everything spilled from the files as desperate people took care of the needs of warmth, sanitation, and revenge in one mad assault on the neatly ordered rows of cabinets. Advance members of our party had reached Frankfurt on March 29th, most of them answering a call from Lucky Forward. General Patton's armored spearheads racing eastward towards Würzburg had stumbled upon the greatest collection of SS loot, art treasures, and Nazi gold reserves ever uncovered in Germany. This mass of carefully indexed material, including everything from the famous collection of paintings of the Kaiser Wilhelm Museum to sacks of gold teeth and suitcases full of gems stripped from victims of the SS murder camps, had been hidden deep in a potash mine at Merkers, east of Frankfurt. Patton roared back to General Eisenhower to send someone up to take responsibility for this hoard. Guarding it was tying up a whole regiment and knocking hell out of one of his divisions, he said. Colonel Bernard Bernstein, to whom we were attached in the financial branch, got the assignment and moved up to Frankfurt and Merkers with every member of the staff he could pull away from other duties. They started the gold rush of 1945, tracking down leads to other Nazi loot and having it shipped back for safekeeping to the commandeered Reichsbank building in Frankfurt. This advance party began burning up the wires for reinforcements from our side. When they saw what was happening to the IG Farben records at Frankfurt, 2 of the Treasury men got a load of German PWs to sweep all of the papers into the west wing of the building where they could at least be sealed off. But the Schaef headquarters commandant arrived in a few days to requisition the building as a future forward headquarters for General Eisenhower, and ordered the building cleared of all this refuse. Army trucks began backing up to the building, hauling off truckloads of the papers and burning them. Only the most vigorous argument could produce so much as a temporary truce, while we tried to round up enough men to do something with the 300 to 400 tons of papers stacked in the West Wing. The token force from Treasury and our one man from Justice soon got support from a technical team attached to the T forces headed by a British officer, Colonel Gordon. This team was in hot pursuit of Farben's secret poison gas experiments, which were supposed to have produced not only the super-poison taboon, a droplet of which meant slow death, but a still more powerful poison, sarin, a smaller droplet of which meant instant death. They found that several hundred carloads of both had been produced, put up in containers disguised as dye-stuff intermediates and other harmless chemicals, and shipped in railway cars billed to Wehrmacht ammunition dumps at points all over Germany. Apparently, the only thing deterring the Wehrmacht from releasing the gases was the fact that no gas mask or decontaminating agent capable of protecting them from the stuff had yet been developed. Some of the Farben chemists were still searching frantically for the antidotes when Colonel Gordon's men picked them up. Intentional or accidental opening of the disguised containers would cause wholesale havoc, and the keys to their identification were somewhere in the Farben production records. Colonel Gordon's men worked fast and talked sharply, but even so, they were just barely equal to the task of keeping the headquarters commandant's men from cleaning up the place to meet its destiny as the most impressive-looking military headquarters in Europe.